Anin Buzu Tanze, John Indigenous. I'd like to welcome everyone to Treaty 1 territory. I understand you had Elders Barb and Clarence with you last night and a drum opening. Treaty 1 territory is the land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dene, and Dakota communities. It's also the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'd like to welcome you here. I'm a settler, John McGavick, from the University of Manitoba, and it's my deep honor to introduce Dr. Michael Joyner for the John Sutton Lecture. As a grad student, I was introduced to John Sutton through his high-altitude work. I had to do a project for David Montgomery. So for those of you in the audience who know David, he was my first mentor. And the breadth and expanse of John Sutton's work was an inspiration, and his vision for exercise physiology was truly an inspiration. I don't know why I'm getting emotional, but in that note, it's really an honor to introduce someone with similar vision, similar expanse, Dr. Michael Joyner from the Great Plains, who himself is an extensive exercise physiologist, an extensive athlete, and a legend in the field. And so it's my honor to introduce Michael Joyner to give the John Sutton Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, John and Vincent. So the title of the talk today is Exercise Physiology's What's Next? But before I start, I want to tell you a little bit about John Sutton. This is a picture of John Sutton right here. He was born in the early 1940s, died, I think, in the middle 1990s. He was interested in all sorts of things. He traveled extensively during medical school, including to China during the Cultural Revolution. He studied altitude and hypoxia, as we've just heard, tremendous studies on heat stroke, also was interested in elite athletes, was a med school dean, and also the first non-U.S. president of ACSM. So he had wide interest, he did a lot, and he did all of this by the time he turned 50, or maybe 54. So it's a real tragedy that he died young, but here's a picture of Dr. Sutton, Professor Sutton, actually cycling someplace probably in Australia. But what I found more interesting, and I think sometimes when you think about the history of our field, you think about somebody's first paper. And John's first paper, Dr. Sutton's first paper, was in the Lancet in 1967. And on the left axis here, the y-axis, you see VO2 max in mLs per kg per minute. And on the x-axis, you see intrinsic heart rate. That's the heart rate after you give people maximum doses of autonomic blocking drugs. This was a huge topic in the 1960s as people began to contemplate how the heart would function when it was de-innervated due to heart transplantation. And you can see here that people who are not particularly fit have very high intrinsic heart rates, and people who are quite fit have low intrinsic heart rates, 70, 80, 90. So that's really an amazing finding, and I didn't know about this paper. And I also found it interesting from a personal perspective because my first studies as a medical student were about beta blockers and exercise. And these were done about 20 years later. So it is sort of interesting that this field is still around and people are still using these techniques. And in fact, we're using something similar in my lab today. But the overview of the talk goes something like this. We're going to talk a little bit about work physiology and where our field came from. Talk a little bit about public health, how it went from work physiology to public health, then how the field got into human performance, talk a little bit about the emerging problems, or I guess the full-blown problems of obesity and aging, the search also for molecular transducers of the good things associated with exercise, and then perhaps give you a bit of a summary and a vision for the future. I have a couple disclosures. I've consulted for Nike, the nutrition company Shaklee, the medical device company Boston Scientific, and the drug company GlaxoSmithKline. So let's look at the history of exercise. So when everybody exercised, this is 200 years ago, and you see on the left Plains Indians involved in the buffalo hunt, and you see on the right people involved in subsistence agriculture. Now, are there any Old Order Amish here in Manitoba? Does everybody here know what the Old Order Amish are? The Old Order Amish are people who've rejected or not adopted modern technology to the extent the rest of us have. And you can see these people in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, and some in Minnesota, and also apparently up here. And they really use traditional farming. So the question is, how physically active are these people? And this is a fascinating slide from Dave Bassett in his work. And you can see here's 10,000 steps per day, which is the magic number if you believe the health guidelines. And this is about 100 old order Amish. And these are their steps per day. Women in the open bars, men in the closed bars. And you can see that hardly anybody got less than 10,000 steps a day. So the question becomes, how physically active were these people? And you can read this as well as I can, but the men got about 18,000 steps a day, the women about 14,000 steps a day. Both groups got 40 hours of physical activity per week. The men about 10 hours of vigorous physical activity, the women about, I think, 3 or 4 hours of vigorous physical activity. And these are really remarkable levels of physical activity, absolutely remarkable levels of physical activity. And as we think about that, that's the way the world was until 200 years ago. And even as late as 1900, 90% of people made their living by doing things that were 90% muscle powered. So even factory work and things like that were largely muscle powered, which brings me to one of the original public health or public concerns of people interested in exercise. Anybody here heard of Mayo, who was one of the first people to study fatigue? And so the original physiologists were involved in the 8-hour workday, and they were also involved in regulating industrial conditions. These were harsh conditions. They were hot. People worked in mines. The air quality was poor. The nutrition was poor. And the question became, how much should people work? And that leads us to the Harvard Fatigue Lab, which was one of the first exercise labs in North America. Anybody know what college at Harvard the Harvard Fatigue Lab was located in? How many people think it was in the medical school? How many people think it was in something to do with biology? How many people think it was in the business school? It was in the business school, which is sort of interesting if you think about it. Now, why was it in the business school? Because they were worried about the health of factory workers. Dill himself was a fascinating guy, was born in 1891. I had the opportunity to meet him because he was the mentor of my mentor's mentor, Jack Wilmore, through Steve Horvath. And Dr. Dill in the late 19-teens was preparing for football season, I think at Occidental College out on the West Coast, and was doing work on the railroads and developed muscle cramps. And that stimulated his interest in so-called work physiology. He later studied at Harvard under L.J. Henderson, was, I believe, sent to Scandinavia to learn some techniques there, and came back and started the fatigue lab because they wanted to know about industrial hygiene. And this is the same story for many, many labs. And so the focus was on what do we need to do to keep the worker as productive as possible. So this wasn't about anybody's health in that sense. It was about the financial health of the country and the financial health of these large companies. Now, a great example of this are heat acclimation studies from World War II done in the Harvard Fatigue Lab. And these studies remain classic. So the concern then was that Caucasian soldiers would be sent to the jungle or the desert and not be able to operate in warm weather. So what they did is they took 5 subjects. You can see them by initials here. This was before privacy. And I think these are the same 5 subjects who are actually the authors of the paper. And they put them in a room that was about 38 or 39 degrees, had them wear military uniforms, and I think it was about 40% relative humidity. And they had them walk, I think about 4 miles an hour, up a treadmill, a reasonable grade, for as long as they could, and then they eventually stopped. So after one day, heart rate was close to 200, I think about 180 here, if I'm reading this correctly. Rectal temperature had risen dramatically. And then guess what? They got to come back and do this every day for 3 or 4 weeks. And you can see that over time they acclimated really quite rapidly. And this led to the view which we currently hold that people can in fact adapt to almost any environment, and that it wasn't necessary to take special precautions for these soldiers going to fight in hot environments, that they would in fact do just fine. Now, after the war, the problem became increasing sedentary lifestyles and an epidemic of coronary artery disease and heart attacks began to occur. So this is the London double-decker bus that's now iconic for the City of London. And what happened is there used to be two employees or two civil servants on each bus. There was a driver who was sitting around driving, and there was a guy running up and down the stairs punching tickets. And they were able to look very carefully at the size of these men because they knew their uniform size when they entered the bus service. So they were able to do all sorts of interesting things related to whether they were the same or different when they entered. But what Morris did and published, I believe, in the late 40s and early 50s was a series of studies looking at bus driver, conductor data, and also civil servants. And you can see here on the far right that there was a bit more angina, I believe, in the conductors versus the drivers, but there was much less coronary artery disease, and that also held true for postmen who walked. At least in the US, the postmen don't walk as much as they used to, but they certainly did in the UK versus telephonists. And you would think, if you thought about that today, that would be largely men perhaps versus women at that time, but in fact the civil servants were almost all men at the time, so the people who were telephone operators, or at least doing a lot of telephone work, were in fact men. So what this shows is that in people that have physically active occupations, that death from coronary artery disease is reduced 25, 30, 40, even 50%. Now, if we fast forward and look at physical activity versus longevity in a sample of 650,000 adults, you can see here that the hazard ratio of mortality as people get up to the guidelines, which is 30 minutes, 5 times a week of moderately vigorous physical activity, you get to about 0.7, so about a 30% reduction in mortality, and you get about 3 years of additional life, and then things sort of parallel off. And what's really interesting about this data, if you look at these curves, and you look at these percentages, 0.6 when you get out here, 4 or 5 years when you get out here, is study after study after study, starting with Morris, shows almost identical hazard ratios or changes in life expectancy. It is absolutely remarkable how consistent this data is in cohort after cohort after cohort. Now, one question that's come up over time is there an upper limit for this protective effect? For many years, people thought that protection went up to about 10 METs, a VO2 max of around 35, and then leveled off. This is a recent publication in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, and about 70,000 people that were studied in the Henry Ford system, and they looked really at the people who were super fit, people with more than 10 METs, and they continued to show that all-cause mortality went down. And one of the interesting things you can say about this data, if you look at the hazard ratio of mortality over, I think about, this was over about 15 years, which is interesting about that. If you think about how medicine is practiced, you could argue that among the super fit, you should probably do nothing except perhaps some cancer screening. You should just leave them alone. Because they are quite protected. And the other interesting thing about this is that a 1 MET increase in physical fitness or cardiorespiratory fitness, it reduces mortality by about 15%. And clearly most people can probably increase their fitness by 1 or 2 METs without too much difficulty. Now, of course, is it fitness or physical activity? That's important to this group because you understand the difference. And this is fitness here, the fittest group, looking at survival data in a large cohort, the most fit, somewhat fit, and lesser fit people. And then if you look at physical activity, not quite as important, but still, if you look at from the physically active to the less active, you see a pretty big gap in mortality over time. And this is who makes it to 90, and this is years of follow-up here. So while they're not completely synonymous, there is some overlap. And I think one of the most interesting and underappreciated findings comes from Robert Ross's studies where he's tracked large numbers of people. And I want you to focus on the right-hand side here. and here. And what you see here is the relationship in a large cohort of quote, unfit middle-aged people between incidental physical activity intensity and their VO2 max. So what this means is the person who occasionally runs up a couple of flights of stairs or occasionally does some brisker form of physical activity tends to have a higher VO2 max. And so I think that while we tend to try to dissociate or think of activity and fitness as perhaps different, they might be more linked than we think based on how much incidental high-intensity activity at least some people are getting. And I think as we get more into the wearables, more into larger data sets, and more into population studies, I think this is going to be a key question that can be addressed with some of these newer techniques. Now, the other thing to remember, I just showed you that there's a vast reduction in cardiovascular and really all-cause mortality associated with being physically active or physically fit. And most people think, sure, physical, at least when I started, the teaching was, and I think Dr. Sutton would have agreed with this, that you're protected because your blood pressure is better, you're less diabetic, your cholesterol is better, and so on and so forth. So if you look in a large cohort of humans, this is from the Nurses' Health Study, 27,000 women, and you say, okay, if we look at the fittest versus the least fit, again, we see this huge protective effect, we get this huge protective effect. And the question is how does it work? Well, if you total up all the risk factors, the changes in lipids and blood pressure and glucose and everything else, you only explain about 59% of the reduction in cardiovascular disease and only about 40% of the reduction in coronary heart disease. So clearly there's something else going on, and there's this so-called missing protection. So the question is, what is this missing protection? And this is just another slide to show you that if you're fit, you're protected from the mortality increases associated with blood pressure, glucose, triglycerides, and cholesterol. So the question then becomes, what is the extra protection afforded by being physically active or physically fit? One is endothelial function is improved, so your blood vessels work better. Two is there's probably structural remodeling, especially in the fittest people. They have bigger blood vessels. Three, your autonomic function is better. Going back to Dr. Sutton's first slide, people have lower intrinsic heart rates and more vagal tone, which can be highly protective. Fourth, there's something called ischemic preconditioning, so people probably, if they do have a heart attack or do have an ischemic event, can probably survive it better. And I think most importantly, the things we forget about is the role of social autonomy. If you just have people take a paper and pencil test and measure their social autonomy, it's almost as valuable, or at least almost as important a risk factor for early death as being physically inactive is. So people who report high levels of social autonomy live 2 or 3 years longer than people who feel like they have no control over anything. But I want to point out to you, so exercise is not a vaccine. Now, how am I going to point that out to you, and how long has this been known for? Anybody besides Rich Usen here know who Clarence DeMar is? Now, Rich did not race against Clarence DeMar, but he could have. No, I don't think so. Were you racing in 1958, Rich? Okay, good. So we would have missed out. So Clarence DeMar really, at some level, is the for lack of a better word, the John the Baptist of the running boom. And he was born in the 1890s. He won a gold medal or a bronze medal in the 1924 Olympics. He was a 7-time Boston champ, first time in 1911 in his early 20s. He won his 7th one at age 41, so he was an original master athlete as well in 1930. And his span of over 19 years to win 7 times is quite remarkable and really shows tremendous longevity. So DeMar dies in 1958. Anybody here heard of the cardiovascular condition Wolff-Parkinson-White? So there was a very famous cardiologist at Harvard named Paul Dudley White. And it's unclear whether White got permission to do this autopsy or whether he had the body exhumed or whether he was a bit of a grave robber. Paul Thompson, who's a noted cardiologist on the East Coast, believes that there was a bit of grave robbing that went on. So they did this autopsy on DeMar, And I've redrawn it here, and you see that DeMar had these huge coronary arteries. He also had a lot of plaque, but it really didn't make any difference, and you could see that the plaque didn't really encroach much. And so he had as much or similar amounts of plaque as a, quote, control subject, but he had these huge, huge coronary arteries, which I find quite interesting as we think about the too much exercise argument and what else might be going on. So it was not a vaccine against coronary artery disease for DeMar, but it did show that this remodeling could protect him from the effects of any occlusions associated with a cholesterol plaque buildup. Now, we've all heard of the too much exercise argument. You can see slides like this. All-cause mortality goes down, again, to the magic number of about 0.6, which we see over and over again. And then among the most active people, it may go up. This becomes very difficult to study because there are so few people that are getting 10x the guidelines, and there are just a host of statistical problems with this. And I like to tell people that one of the things about the too much exercise community is that they frequently forget this study. This is data from 50,000 Swedes who've completed the 90-kilometer Vasaloppet cross-country ski race. And you can see here that the more races you've completed, the lower your all-cause mortality right here. And again, it just gets lower and lower. Also true for people that complete the race faster. Now, these people do have a bit more AFib, but it's really not clear if that's due to the exercise per se or just the fact that they have low resting heart rates and some other things that happen which could cause AFib. But again, so when you look in this large cohort of super active people, you exploit the Swedish medical records database and so forth, you see not a whole lot of evidence for the too much exercise argument. So now we've talked about kind of the first two phases of exercise physiology, work physiology, and then this early interest in public health. I want to switch a little bit to human performance because it's an area of interest of mine. And there have been accurate records since the late 1800s. Times are clearly getting faster. This is due, at least in part, due to more and harder training, although that's really leveled off in the last 30 or 40 years. By the 1960s and certainly by the 70s, people were training as hard as possible. More people are participating. In other words, it's not just people from rich countries. We certainly have seen the rise of the East Africans. We'll talk a little bit about technical advances, shoes, tracks, and so forth. And then I want to point out that the gene pool, of course, for all of this is unchanged. These are just some world record marathon times. You can see the men's record comes way, way down quickly as people begin to train more and more. And then it's been relatively stable, and the rate of improvement has been slow. The women's record dropped like a rock as soon as women were allowed to participate, as they quickly adopted the training plans that the men used. You then see it went down, 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 and Paula Radcliffe's wonderful times here. We're starting to see some times in the 2:17s, 2:18s, so who knows how long Miss Radcliffe's record will last. But again, you see it's really a fast time and a true outlier. You also see that Olympic times tend to be a little bit slower than world records because the conditions are not optimal. So in 1991, I had a little bit of fun because I got a programmable calculator and started asking myself, you know, a motivated guy with too much time, yellow legal pad, and said to myself, because at the time, we started to think about VO2 max, the lactate threshold, and running economy as crucial determinants of performance. And I simply said, what would happen if the same person had the best values ever reported for all three variables? And if you work your way through this, you'll see that if the same person had the best values for all three variables, they would have a very high running speed at lactate threshold. And I predicted that their marathon time would be less than 2 hours. I think it's 1:57:58 in this particular paper. So this paper lies dormant for a while, and it's just kind of a novelty. And I really wrote the paper as a model, not because I wanted to predict that somebody was going to break 2 hours, but because I wanted to say what was the difference between the current world record, which was about 2:07 at the time, and the predicted world record, and maybe identify areas where we had some ignorance or new areas of research or areas where we needed to learn more, especially related in this particular case to genetics to some extent, I said at the time, but also running economy and the biomechanics of running, and certainly issues related to fatigue. So not much was known about running economy at the time. Fatigue is a complicated thing, I pointed out. There was limited data in true elites, And there was not much known at the time about the genetics of performance. In 2011, as time started to come down, we updated this and predicted that somebody would come close to 2 hours sometime in the next 10 or perhaps 20 or 25 years. Then Nike got involved, and I went, as my wife said, from validated to over-validated. And they started to test some of these ideas, and oh so close, sort of. So this is the great Elliott Kipchoge running 2 hours and 25 seconds. I don't know if this says 25 or 26, as he crosses the line at Monza. And what they did was A, have pacers, B, run on a flat course, minimal right angle turns. They had all kinds of pacing and drafting. They had relatively cool temperatures, but maybe not as cool as they thought. Alex Hutchison, who I think is here from the Sweat Science blog spot, now working with Outside, Alex, I think, was there, and it was cool, but not that cool. If it maybe had been 5 degrees cooler, who knows? They were going to do something to the shoes, and the question is, and this obviously became controversial, was this just a Nike-funded publicity stunt or a proof of concept trial? And depending on who you believe, if you go to the running blogs and the running sites, Nike is evil corporation, and it was a publicity stunt, where other people felt it was a bit, and I'm kind of in the latter camp, a proof of concept thing. So what did they do in terms of the shoes? This is an old paper from Scientific American in the late 1970s, and a number of scientists at the time at MIT attempted to tune tracks so the stiffness of the track was optimized to improve elastic recoil from the lower extremity of humans. They did this, and they found that these good but not great college runners were running 2 or 3% faster on this tuned track at MIT. So what Nike attempted to do was the track and the shoe trick. And you can see here's their new shoe, and they have a carbon plate here. And you can see, and this is obviously a highly scientific slide that I took on my iPhone at a poster at ACSM, which shows you both the advantages and disadvantages of an iPhone, I guess, smartphones. And somebody, John, sent me something from a BlackBerry, and I thought, my God, they still make them. But anyways, I had them, they were great. But and you can see this plate here, and you can see that the hysteresis and between the standard Nike shoe, the state-of-the-art Adidas shoe, and the lack of this hysteresis here, so you get more back from this shoe. And they had claims that this was going to cause a 2 or 3% or 4% improvement in running economy, so on and so forth. Who knows how true any of that is, but it's certainly an interesting concept. So they showed what's possible. Now I think the next big thing that's happened is talent identification. This is Helen Glover. People here know about the British START program or what they've done at the Australian Institute of Sport for rowing. They realized that not all good rowers go to Oxford and Cambridge. And so what they did is they went around the country and said, are you tall? Do you like to work out? Do you want to be tested? Now, did they do gene testing on these people, or did they put them on an ergometer and see how many pull-ups they could do? They put them on an ergometer and saw how many pull-ups they can do. And a large, Britain and Australia really have done very well in rowing using these programs. And I think about 40% of the many medals they've gotten have come from people who participated in the START program. They've also been very successful in track cycling. And if you talk to Louise Burke, part of the reasons in both cases was they felt that there were a lot of medals in these disciplines, and there was not a whole lot of competition. In other words, it wasn't like track and field or swimming or soccer, where there was kind of a big worldwide participation base. Now, what about strength training for all? Anybody here know who this is? This is Mark Spitz, who's 6'2" and weighs 165 pounds with his 7 gold medals. Spitz is interesting for a couple of reasons, because I think he was 22 years old when he won his last race. This is Michael Phelps at about age 30. He's 6'4", weighs about 205. So you can see one of the things that's really happened in the last 30 or 40 years is that there's strength training for everybody. The other thing this shows is that with professionalization, people like Phelps go for Olympic after Olympics after Olympics. I think Phelps participated in 5, Spitz participated in 2. Now, if the financial incentives had been there, he might have continued much longer, and who knows, somebody might have been able to convince him to weightlift. This is one of my favorite ones. This is Jesse Owens versus Neil deGrasse. From a Canadian TV show. So deGrasse is, I believe, around about 9'8", maybe faster. They put him on a dirt track with no starting blocks and hand timed him, and it came up to about 11 flat. About 11 flat. And there's a terrific CBC show where they've gone over this over and over again. And in various disciplines to see, is it the athlete or the equipment? Is it pole vaulter or the pole? Now, of course, there's the dark side. This is doping. This shows the increase in VO2 max after EPO use. Just one slide here. My favorite doping example. Anybody know who this is? Stu, where are the bodybuilders and weightlifters around here? Who knows? Steve Reeves, right, there you go. Well, so, as people know, it's one of my eyes doesn't move, and in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. But the other interesting thing, that was one of Mike Tchaikovsky's favorite lines when I used to work with him. But look at Dorian Yates here. So I'm not sure all this increased muscle mass would improve athletic performance, but certainly steroids probably do something. All right, so now what happens, there's a lot of interest in Canada with high-intensity training, and this is an interesting topic, but what happens when regular citizens train like elites? This is one of my favorite studies ever. This is the Hickson protocol. When Bob Hickson was working with, the late Bob Hickson was working with John Hollisey in the 1970s, they recruited 7 or 8 sedentary people from around the hospital and put them on a program of 6 times 5 minutes at about 95% of VO2 max with 2 minutes rest on a bike 3 days a week, and the other days they had them run 45 minutes as fast as they could. And what did they find? They found huge increases in VO2 max. The group mean went from the low 40s to almost 60. There was a linear increase in VO2 max, and you can see that it just sort of kept rising and rising and rising. They offered to allow these people to continue to train to see if their VO2 max would continue to rise, and everyone declined because the program was so rigorous. But the point here is that a lot of people can get VO2 maxes in the high 50s or low 60s for men, and for women perhaps 10% lower. We knew that in the original running boom back in the 1970s and early 80s. You can't believe what some of the people who broke 3 hours for the marathon looked like. I mean, there was ex-football players running with knee braces, breaking 3 hours, and mostly because they ran a lot and just got very lean. This is some earlier data from Scandinavia showing 3 world-class cross-country skiers over time, and showing 2 guys who decided for some reason to train like world-class skiers, and they got their VO2 max values to 60 and remained there for some time. So that's the other thing we need to think about is most training studies we do are short-term. And again, if people go for long periods of time, many, many people, if they train hard and get lean, can get close to 60. One of the more interesting things recently is there's at least some evidence that women have less left ventricular hypertrophy than men. These are the baseline VO2 max data for males and females. This is after 12 months of training. I didn't put the statistics bars here, but you see the, I believe this is left ventricular mass here. You can see that the women went up a little bit less. So I think that's sex differences in terms of some of the adaptations to training, especially the cardiovascular, in terms of the cardiovascular structural changes, are something of great interest, and hopefully people will begin to follow up on these great observations from Ben Levine's group down in Dallas. So now we've switched and almost come full circle. So we had a problem of trying to understand how humans adapted to literally physical activity and occupational physical activity all day long. And now we've flipped it and have this obesity problem, and also the wonderful challenge of aging. In the US, Make America Great Again, we're number 1. You can hear Mexico's number 2, Canada's number 3, so it's a North American sweep. depending on who you believe, these numbers for obesity are at 35%. The most recent data I saw for the US was 39%. Who knows if they're going up, leveling off, or whatever, but it's just not a good thing. There's actually some data in the US that life expectancy is starting to flatten out or actually go down a little bit. And there are lots of explanations for it, but some people think it's obesity-driven diabetes. We talked a little bit about the mailman the other day ago. In 1960, 50% of people got moderate physical activity at work. Now, very few get moderate physical activity at work. The number of people who are totally sedentary at work has gone up, and the people who only get light physical activity has also gone up. So we've gone from walking mailmen to driving mailmen to ticket takers on the buses, going up and down the buses, to swipe cards and so forth. And the amount of physical activity we get just in our daily lives has gone down, down, down. My colleague Jim Levine claims that every time you use your remote control to change the TV set, you're depriving yourself of 5 calories of physical activity. So, you know, as you switch from one thing to the next, remember that. So now here's one of the most interesting studies ever, and this goes back to the industrial hygiene days. And I believe there's the word industrial hygiene is in an industrial, male population in West Bengal. This is a classic study from the late 1950s by Jean Mayer, who is a very well-known nutritionist. And what does it show? So on the very far axis, you have people that are totally sedentary to people that are hacking away at the jute with machetes and doing really hard physical labor. You see here, I believe this is calorie intake. You see that the people who do nothing eat a lot. The people who do moderate levels of physical activity don't eat so much. And the people that do a lot of physical activity have to eat a hell of a lot or they can't do the activity. But look at the body weights here. The body weights go down and stay down, but they don't continue to drop. And so it appears to be that there's something related to physical activity, especially moderate levels of physical activity, that helps people regulate their appetite and eat the right amount so that they get to a nice kind of a sweet spot in terms of body weight. And one argument is that as we gain weight in rich countries, we have New Year's, Christmas, Easter, different holidays, and people's weight ratchets up. But we don't have harvest, we don't have hunting, we don't have periods of intense physical activity and periods of intense caloric deficit. And so people who are able to be physically active all day long are somewhat buffered from the occasional feast. Now let's talk a little bit about aging. This is from Scotland. I picked it because it was a free graphic on the internet, but it also shows the data pretty well. This is what population looked like in 1911. A lot of young people, not very many old people. This is by the middle 1950s and the beginning of the baby boom. Things had started to flatten out here, partly because of vaccines and sanitation. And so you had more and more people making it older and older. This is the very beginning of the baby boom here. Here's the baby boom moving like a rodent through a snake. And you see you've now got very few young people, a whole lot of older people, but a lot of middle-aged people. And these are the projections for later on, where you're going to have an inverse pyramid, where you're going to have more old people than young people. Does anybody know of a country where that's currently happening today? Japan. Japan is really got an upside-down population pyramid. And they've got huge numbers of people in their 90s and over 100. And they're really struggling to figure out how to provide services for all those people with so few young people. And one of the most interesting things here is that we'll have an older world. And sometime in the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to have more people over 60 than less than 14. How many people here knew all 4 of their grandparents? All right, so 1990 or 2000 is the first year in rich countries where more than 50% of people were alive when all 4 of their grandparents were alive also, which is a wonderful thing to have 4 grandparents alive, but it just shows you how far we've come in terms of longevity and aging. So if you look at the people who raise their hand, they tend to be a little bit younger. And that's something to think about. What are we going to do in a society like this? Well, one thing we need to do is not so much think about lifespan, but we need to think about health span. I've shown you the data about physically active people living, 4 or 5 years longer. If you look at people who follow all the guidelines, like the Seventh-day Adventists out in California, you get maybe even 10 years of increased life expectancy, but you get 15 and sometimes even 20 years of disability-free life expectancy or increased health span. Increased health span. So the story of the physically active and the people who follow the guidelines is that they live to be really old, they don't have a lot of disability, and then they die of a brief illness, which is a good way to go. Because if we don't, and you think about health system costs, even if you have a crazy system like we have in the US, or a little bit more coordinated one like you have up here, one of the big problems is people get into their 50s and 60s and they start to ratchet down, start developing a whole lot of chronic diseases. Those chronic diseases just are resource sinks for society. And then they continue to live. And when I first started medicine in the early 80s, those people died. Now they go into kidney dialysis, implantation of defibrillators, and they continue to live, which is wonderful, but they live at very high cost in terms of their use of medical and social services. So we need to think a little bit about that. And we know, of course, that if we compare inactivity versus aging, one of the most iconic studies is from the Dallas bed rest study done in the middle 1960s. This study was stimulated by the fact that astronauts were getting off the spaceships in the middle 60s and not being able to do very much and fainting and just really having a hard time. So they took Gunnar Blomqvist, Bengt Saltin, and Jerry Mitchell, took 5 young men, put them at bed rest in Dallas for 3 weeks. 2 were athletes, 3 were untrained, and they showed this marked drop in their VO2 max. They then, Ben Levine's group, working with Jerry and Bengt, then found these people 30 years later and remeasured their VO2 maxes, and you can see that 3 weeks of inactivity was equal to about 30 years of aging on VO2 max. And so I think that the message of all this is that physical inactivity a little goes a long way. In other words, you can really go down the toilet quickly. And physical activity a little also goes a long way because the guidelines are quite remarkable and that it only takes about 30 minutes a day. And people start to get a benefit from as little as 10 minutes a day. So how many people think that if all we have to do is explain to people the guidelines, promote the guidelines, and before we know it, everybody's going to be doing their 150 minutes of voluntary physical activity per week? Anybody here do drugs early this morning and believe that? Do we have any optimists here? All right, well, 10 or 20 years ago, that's what we would have told people, but obviously that's not working. And I wonder about transportation policy. Do we need to make it, and it's tough in a big city like this, but we certainly see it in places like Copenhagen or Amsterdam, the power of active transport. Now, this is just some data on BMI units and people that do a whole lot of active transportation here versus none. And this is from the 100,000 Genomes Project in the UK, where they actually ended up showing the biggest gene variant is worth about 0.2 BMI units, where active transportation is about 1.5. So I'm not sure they set out to show that it was environment and behavior trumping genetics in that particular large cohort, but they certainly did here. So that's something to think about. What do we need to do in terms of transport policy? And also, what do we need to do about food policy, ag policy? I would encourage everybody here to get this book, How Cycling Can Save the World, by Peter Walker. It's a terrific, terrific book. It's got a bunch of anecdotes in there, but there's a whole bunch of actual scientific papers and technical reports from governments about promoting active transportation and cycling and safe cycling in cities. Really, really a terrific book. I follow Mr. Walker on Twitter. He's a columnist for The Guardian and is an amazing character. So I think, again, we need to think about how we promote active transportation. And I personally don't think the physical activity or physical inactivity, I guess, epidemic or pandemic is going to go anywhere until we have a serious discussion about how humans relate to cars. And that's a personal opinion, but I think hopefully it'll be borne out over time. Now, the other question to ask ourselves is, why are some population interventions for diet and obesity more effective and equitable than others? And this is about personal agency. Anybody here know what personal agency is? Well, everybody in this room, because we have advanced degrees or pursuing advanced education and are highly educated, has a lot of personal agency. Basically, there's a lot of ways to describe it, but that is, A, you feel like you have some control over your life. B, you have some control over your environment. C, you see some connection between your personal behavior today and a future outcome or delayed gratification. But here's what happens when you rely in a general population on issues related to choice alone. So this is putting folate in the food supply reduces dramatically the incidence of spina bifida and spinal cord defects in babies. Now you have two ways to do this. Way one is an individualized way. You give the information leaflet to people at the doctor's office. 80% pick up the leaflet, 20% don't. 80% actually read the leaflet, 20% don't. 80% have some understanding of what happens, 20% don't. You go down this, and at the end of the day, about 320 women are actually have gone to the pharmacy and gotten a folate supplement. The other thing to do is just put it in the bread, and 800 people get it, and 200 people decide to go to the health food store and get a different kind of bread. So I think until you take these population-based approaches on things that have such a behavioral element, you're not going to do a whole lot. You're not going to do a whole lot. And that's why I think we have to have ag policy, and we have to have transportation policy. But if you think back 100 years ago, when people literally were dying of overwork, the fact and undernutrition, to think that we want to eat as much as we can and we want to drive around as much as possible and do as little as possible maybe makes some sense. It wasn't always this way. What about molecular transducers? This is the big new thing. Carson Lundby and I have argued that people can look for all the molecular transducers they want, but until they explain cardiac output, which is linear related to VO2 max and has an R value of about 0.968, or total body hemoglobin, they're not going to find much. There's no evidence of a common DNA variant profile specific to world-class endurance athletes. As I just pointed out, the physiological pathways are quite clear. They explain a very large fraction of the variance. The dominance of oxygen transport, cardiac size, and hemoglobin really matter. And candidate genes like the ACE variants have failed so far. So I think until we look under the physiology lamp, we're not going to find a whole lot. And again, is this an exercise in futility? Carson and I, along with David Montero, have pointed out that most humans men can get their VO2 maxes in the high 50s, women again about 10% lower. And until you start to look under the physiology lamp and look for gene variants that explain these deterministic physiological pathways, we think it's going to be a bit of an exercise in futility. Now, my opinion aside, the NIH doesn't agree with me, so they've set up this large thing called motorpack down in the US. They're going to study 2,700 subjects and do parallel animal studies, trying to look for the molecular transducers and find out what's going on with all these protective effects of exercise. And you can, again, read as well as I can. It's hard to read from this angle. That will extensively characterize a variety of molecules that can change following exercise and may transmit the benefits of physical activity to organs and tissues that are not directly involved in the movement. I think that's one of the other most interesting things about these molecular transducers are trying to understand the remote effects of training. This is a terrific study from Mark Tarnopolsky's group, and these show progeroid mice, animals that have a specific mitochondrial defect. It's been engineered into them. They undergo premature aging. You can see here, the group, Mark's group, put these animals on what I call the YMCA program, had them exercise, I believe, about 45 minutes 3 times a week, and we're able to eliminate or reverse many of the findings. And importantly, things like cataracts, behavioral changes, things that were not directly involved in the training, also were blunted. So again, evidence that there's something going on, And the idea that skeletal muscle is this essentially internal drug factory pumping out all sorts of substances with remote effects, I think is really most interesting. So we've talked a little bit about work physiology and giving the history of our field. Talked about how it drifted into public health, then from public health to human performance. Now we have really the flip side of the original coin, or the original question, the obesity and aging problem. And we've got this search for molecular transducers and to try to understand some of the signaling mechanisms and certainly some of the remote signaling that occurs with exercise. And I think that these two issues, obesity and aging and public health, on the population and implementation side are obviously the next big things. And again, these molecular transducers, especially the remote signaling, are the next big things. But I leave you with this. This is a 95-year-old or 92-year-old woman named Johanna Quas, who's been physically active her whole life. This was taken when she's 91. She was born in 1925. Now for the impressive part. So I would say that when we look at that and we look at what's up in society, we have to remember the quote from the great historian Arnold Toynbee, who said, "Civilizations die from suicide, not by murder." And I think if we don't do something about underactivity and overnutrition, we're committing suicide as a civilization. So thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes for questions, about 5 minutes, and if it's okay with whoever, we'll take a few questions. Thank you. Who wants to go first? Rich.
Yeah, Mike, as John first PhD student, thank you very much for a fantastic lecture being on. It's interesting, your very first data slide there actually of John and his intrinsic heart rate data. I don't know if you noticed, but there was just a point counterpoint published in JAP. But getting back to this discussion of is it intrinsic heart rate or is it vehicle activity?
Right. Well, and I think the other thing that paper is important too, Richard, is that that all this discussion of heart rate variability and people trying to make all sorts of claims about it reflecting sympathetic activity when it is so vagal or intrinsically dominated. I think you have a terrific study where you gave people beta blockers and didn't really show. You really got to give people the atropine to make it go away. So I think this comes up again and again because with heart rate variability, you know, it's easy to measure, so people get into it and then they want to turn it into some sort of magic proof of everything. But just because something is easy to measure doesn't mean it's as meaningful as people would like to think. So you have to be a little bit careful and do the types of mechanistic studies that John did back in 1967. I mean, how would you like to have your first paper published in The Lancet? My God. Next question. Stu.
You gave one slide dedicated to showing the benefit, well, two slides maybe to show spits versus golf or strength training. Next year's ACSM, we have a symposium entitled "What if Gym Fix or Can Cooper were lifters instead of runners?" I'd like you to comment on the fact that it might be the forgotten part of the guidelines, but what is the strength training fit in here? Is it as good as all of what you're doing with the aerobics, or is it just something that we're...
Well,
you asked me just
yeah, about squats. So
on squats, right?
Right.
So there's more qualified people in this room to advise you, but my question is really...
But there's no more enthusiastic people in the room.
Standing up, right?
With more Twitter followers.
Right. My index is still below certain other people on
Yeah.
Twitter. So, but the point is
The Kardashian Index, I believe that's called.
speak like well done, man. This is how it works on Twitter.
Right.
that it is as protective as the improvement in fitness? Or is it just like Fix and Cooper would have said that muscle is an inert mass that we carry around and it's just a
Yeah. So here are a couple things. This is one of my favorite slides. This is sit to rise data in a large group of people, and this is not a setup, a large group of Brazilians, I think about 2,000. And this shows a bunch of middle-aged people. Essentially, the group in the bottom can't get off the floor. This group can pop right up. Now, you see the same kinds of survival curves for self-selected walking speed. You see them for grip strength and so forth. So certainly the epidemiology, especially as people get to be 65 or 70, supports that strength is probably more important and it becomes a better predictor, because what kills people is frailty. And that's going to be a huge problem with disability. And you said I showed 2 slides, Stu, but I think the last video of that woman who'd been strength training her whole life is really, and any golfers here? I would encourage everybody to go watch Gary Player at age 82 swing a golf club. It is the damnedest thing you've ever seen. I mean, there's just nothing like it. And Gary Player's been weightlifting. You talk about Phelps versus Mark Spitz. Well, Gary Player was doing that stuff in the late 50s and early 60s, and he's a lifelong core strength, leg press. I think he does 1,000 crunches a day. And it is absolutely incredible to watch him hit a golf ball. And it's the same as the older female gymnast I just showed you. So I think we do need to get into strength training. I personally have changed my program a little bit, partly because I have young kids, but partly because I don't want to slip and fall on the ice, break my hips, because a lot of what happens to people is a fall or something else like that. It's bad news, and the way to avoid falls is to work on your coordination and remain strong. I agree with you completely, Stu. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You made the comments at the end there about the policies.
Yep.
Are there other policies that would, help the population be some more active that you can?
Yeah, I think transportation is probably number one, but I think if you look at cigarette smoking and traffic safety have been the 2 big public health successes in rich countries. And so they have a whole suite of things. They raise the prices, they tax certain things. You can't buy things in vending machines. You can't smoke in bars. There's just a whole collection of things like that. And I think the urban design people and the nudge people understand this. One of the classic stories about nudging is in Germany and Austria, both German-speaking countries. In Germany, you have opt-in for organ donation. And I think about 10 or 15% of people check the box and say, I'll donate my organ. In Austria, you have opt-out, and only a few % of people opt out. So they have much higher organ donation rates. So I think how you frame the question and how you do the urban design is important. And what's the largest soft drinks, sugar-sweetened beverage you can buy at Tim Hortons to go with your donut? You can get, what, a liter? Triple. Are you serious?
3 greens, 3 sugars.
And you can get these huge soft drinks,
More calories than the soft.
Yeah, right, okay. Well, there you go. So, I'm not sure people need to be able to purchase 500 calories of sugar-sweetened beverage wherever they want to go. So I think you have to do what Mayor Bloomberg did and start thinking about limiting portion size. Again, this is the other question here that proves who's over 50. Does anybody here remember and this shows before you guys went metric in Canada, anybody remember the old 6.5 or 7 ounce Coke bottles? Yeah, 12 ounces was a real treat when it came out. And again, down in the U.S., they're now selling 7 and 8 ounce cans of pop. Are they doing that here as well? And so it's great because you go down to the supermarket, and one of the interesting things about supermarkets is all social classes and educational classes have to go there. And so you see the skinny moms who get into minivans afterwards, who you would think are a little bit better off, get in new minivans with the 8 ounce pops, where you see other people maybe getting into older cars with different BMIs, with the big things, which goes back to the agency issue. So they're not telling their kids they can't have any, but they're saying you can have 8 ounces. Other questions? All right, well, thank you very much.